Today's video has everything, and it's one of the most important episodes in all of modern monetary history. We've got one of the most legendary firms on Wall Street just blatantly cheating with the Treasury Department. And when they got caught red handed by the government, was nearly put out of business only to be saved at the last minute by none other than Warren Buffett. Even Jerome H. Powell makes an appearance here. But what the government figured out afterward was that basically everyone was doing it. The entire dealer system was cheating from top to bottom, all trying to do the same thing at the same time. And no one in the mainstream media had any idea why all this went down. The Los Angeles Times at the time called it a quote, inept little scam, which in their findings reportedly netted this disgraced firm barely a few $1,000,000. It had risked everything. And for what? What appeared to be nothing more than a few cents. That's what no one could figure out, but we're going to make it make sense here in our latest Make It Make Sense video. Now, all the big regulators, of course, they issued a lengthy, exhaustive, and frankly damning 197-page report on the whole thing. But yet, like the Eurodollar itself, basically no one has ever heard the story. Even when Warren Buffett was in front of Congress trying to save the bank, it wasn't ever really made clear why or what it was all really about. That's the much larger matter. The more important aspect, which still sticks around with us to this day, some 3.5 decades after it all happened. The story of Salomon Brothers in the early 1990s illustrated how everything had radically changed by then and what that would mean for the future that we would come face to face with in 2008. It was all right there in 1990 and 1991 as the world was instead fixated on the Middle East and Saddam Hussein. On August 21st, 1991, CalPERS announced that it was cutting ties with Salomon Brothers, explicit in its condemnation, saying it was outraged and disappointed that this investment house would knowingly try to circumvent securities rules. There was a congressional investigation at the time. The Securities and Exchange Commission was making threats. There was even a possibility of criminal charges. It was so outrageous that even Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady, reportedly with Alan Greenspan on board, considered yanking Salomon Brothers' primary dealer privilege, which would have meant the end of Salomon right there and then. Now, Solly, as the firm used to be known, was the Wall Street firm that epitomized the 1980s more than any others, being famously written up in Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker and Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of the Vanity. It even gave rise to the term Masters of the Universe. And even though Gordon Gekko of the movie Wall Street was a corporate raider, it was the bond traders who made all the bank at the time, and they still do to this day. Now, what set Salomon Brothers apart in the 1980s was their high level willingness to bring on the finance professionals, the early quants that were sure they could find the right prices and thus identify the fattest and cleanest arbitrage spread. Solly had pioneered the use of quants under legendary trader John Merriweather, who would go on to found another genius project called LTCM. What happened in late 1990 and early 1991 was still a matter of conjecture, even on the government side. But what is not in doubt is that Solly's chief government securities trader, Paul Moer, was openly flaunting U.S. Treasury rules about the federal government's debt auctions. Treasury had never restricted how much any particular dealer could bid for debt at auction, at least not before then, but would from time to time make individual and ad hoc efforts to ensure orderly and fair operation. But during the December 27, 1990 sale, Moser, via Solomon's own account, bid for $2.975 billion of the $8.5 billion total four-year note auction, or a whopping 35% of the whole sale. And he did so in what was later to be uncovered as an unauthorized use of a customer account for an additional $1 billion bid. And then in April 1991, Salomon bid for $3 billion of a $9 billion five-year note auction, and being awarded the full $3 billion allotment plus an overbid on a customer account, which was not again authorized. But things really came to a head in May of 1991 in an auction that just went too far, causing more than a little consternation and attention. All told, Salomon placed bids for its accounts and those of its customers, plus an undisclosed existing long position for more than 100% of all available two-year notes at that sale. Furthermore, these bids were highly aggressive, priced a full 2 basis points through the when issued price. What was most egregious about all this was that only months before these auctions, and a few others that were uncovered later on, a 35% limitation on bid amounts was put in place specifically to stop Paul Moser. Deputy Assistant Treasury Secretary Michael Bansham had called Mosier in June of 1990, after Solomon had bid more than 100% for $8 billion in notes that were auctioned back then. Bansham later testified that he told Mosier not to do it again during that call in June of 1990. But just a week later, after the call, Mosier did, which led to the 35% restriction being adopted, and it carried the name the Mosier Bansham Rule. For Solomon's part as the offending firm, Treasury was reportedly incensed at management, including the CEO, found out after the May 1991 auction, but told nobody about it, even after several official contacts between the government and Solomon. For several weeks, the firm kept mostly silent while the Treasury Department, the Fed, and the SEC all went about investigating. That led to, on August 18th, Treasury announcing that it would suspend Solomon from its auctions, basically a virtual death penalty for the bank, until a fellow by the name of Warren Buffett intervened on that very afternoon, and he did so personally with Secretary Brady. Buffett even testified before both houses of Congress that the bank was sure it was completely contrite and reflective. The guilty parties, including management, had been expunged from the operation, and there would be no more absurdity going forward. He went even so far, Warren Buffett did, as to publish a 2-page letter to shareholders in October of 1991 in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, even the Financial Times of London. But why? Why would Salomon Brothers risk everything blatantly flaunting these Treasury rules? Why were they bidding so much at these auctions for what seemed to be unknown purposes? This was the part no one could figure out. It seemed like a whole lot of dangerous business that yielded practically nothing. Salomon Brothers basically risked its entire business to cheat at these auctions, and what did it get out of it? The Los Angeles Times in February 1992 wrote, "Investigations are continuing, but findings so far indicate that the crisis escalated far out of proportion to the money involved. Mosier's inept little scam had netted the firm only a pittance between $3.3 million and $4.6 million and cost taxpayers nothing in interest. Contrasted with the billion-dollar looting of the stock market by convicted felons Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken, Mosier's crime seemed small potatoes, but it was enough to bring his swaggering company to the brink of ruin." Now, the idea of cornering a market was nothing new. In fact, if you go back to 1979, which was still fresh in the memories of regulators at the time, the Hunt brothers of Kansas City Chiefs fame had attempted to do the same thing in silver. Cornering the market is when speculators quietly buy up more and more of a valuable commodity. And when they acquire enough of it, they can begin charging higher and higher prices since they control too much of the supply, and therefore they're profiting from a non economic imbalance the speculators themselves create for the sole purpose of profiting on the price appreciation. So naturally, when the government's report on the Salomon Brothers scandal came out, it delved into the potential for cornering the market in treasuries. If you read through the report itself, it quickly becomes clear the trio of agencies that conducted the investigation and then published its findings didn't really get it either. There was this idea of cornering treasuries, and it had something to do with repo markets, but the full weight of the entire episode, what was really going on here, seemed to escape everyone's grasp. As the report itself says, prior to the auction, one specific auction, Solomon determined to finance his own position through repos with short sellers and institutional lenders. In addition, Solomon agreed to finance positions of its customers, and as a result of having purchased a large part of the supply of May 2-year notes, Solomon and his customers were able to lend through repos a portion of these notes that were held special repo rates. A security is said to be on special when, due to its scarcity, a holder can enter into a repo at a lower rate of interest and thus a lower financing cost than the prevailing or general repo rate. The rates that Solomon actually received were generally 100 to 200 basis points below the then prevailing general repo rates. Because Salomon Brothers, through its own accounts and its control over customer accounts, had acquired such huge supplies of these on the run auction treasuries, it could basically control the flow of collateral in repo and therefore create favorable pricing for the cash that it borrowed on a secured basis. That's what in special in repo means. It means that counterparties who are lending cash but are desperate for collateral because collateral needs to flow are willing to receive a much lower return on lending that cash because they want the scarce collateral that Salomon Brothers and its customer accounts actually hold. That was the inept little scam. And it was neither inept nor was it little, because controlling collateral meant exerting control over the entire flow of global money through collateral. And for a company like Salomon Brothers that was already struggling to begin with, it was able to fund some of its operation, a good part of its operations, at cheaper and cheaper rates, while at the same time being able to tell its customers, I can get you cheaper repo rates because I control the flow of collateral. But it only mattered because the flow of collateral had become so incredibly important to the entire financial world. And so everyone began to find out this was not limited to just Solly. As the Washington Post wrote in September 1991, in addition to breaking rules at Treasury auctions, Solomon has admitted that it also misled government sponsored enterprises such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac when placing orders for their bonds. At yesterday's hearing, back in September 1991, an executive from Freddie Mac said that 18 of the brokerage firms that act as dealers for its bonds have reported that they exaggerated the size of their customers' orders. And think about what he just said. It wasn't just Salomon Brothers and Treasuries, it was Salomon Brothers at GSE auctions. And it wasn't just Salomon Brothers at GSE auctions, there were 18 others doing the same thing, trying to acquire more and more of these agency bonds. And it only got worse. This auction cheating scandal led the government to take a closer look at more than just Salomon Brothers and go farther beyond strictly treasuries. What they found should have been a wake up call in the sense that the whole monetary world had been radically redrawn, that everything they were teaching us in schools, everything that we saw on TV, every statement out of a Federal Reserve official's mouth, it was all a lie. The way in which the monetary system worked, the way in which money flowed, was entirely different. It led to this supremacy of collateral and therefore the primacy of the flow of collateral. While the public was never told and the media never found out and the government didn't really understand, the Wall Street banks and the money dealers, they did understand, which was why they were doing it. And that's why it was so widespread. Back to the government report. On January 16, 1992, administrative proceedings were instituted jointly by the SEC, the OCC, and the Federal Reserve against 98 registered broker dealers, registered government securities brokers, and or dealers and banks. In those proceedings, the three agencies found that in connection with their participation in the primary distributions, each of the respondents made and kept certain records that did not accurately reflect the respondents' customer orders for the GSE securities and or offers and purchases and sales by the respondent of the GSE securities. They uncovered that a number of these broker dealers were reporting to GSEs inaccurate information concerning customer orders, and that nearly every single one of the members reported inaccurate information concerning sales of the securities afterward. Some of the traders were adding just random amounts to their customer accounts. Others increased the number and amount of customer orders that were reported to the GSEs that included things like anticipated and historic sales. They even found that members were keeping separate sets of books so that they could cheat at these auctions and still try to have some idea of where everything was supposed to end up. They did everything they possibly could. We're talking about nearly all of those who were investigated, 98 of them. All of them were interested in doing whatever they possibly could to make sure that they got the most of the biggest allotment that they could possibly get of these recently auctioned on the run securities in treasuries and agency debt. The best of the best collateral. And we're talking about on the run, just auctioned. It really is the best of the best of the best collateral. Now, Jerome Powell's name doesn't appear specifically on the report, but he was instrumental both in putting it together and, more importantly, bringing the Salomon case to its resolution. In 1991, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Domestic Finance. Now, later in October of 2017, while speaking to the Treasury Market Practices Group, Powell recalled his early 90s experience. In fact, he told the group that the chapter in Warren Buffett's biography called The Snowball, that the chapter in it that deals with the Solly affair, quote, still gives me nightmares. But why? As Powell said in 2017, as we drew up the 1992 report, we were deeply aware of the importance that the Treasury markets held for the American economy. Treasury securities are also an important source of collateral within the financial system. So far, so good. But yet, in the very next sentence, he couches this idea of collateral in the context of Basel III regulations. He said, this last role has become all the more critical in recent years as regulations have required banks to hold larger amounts of high quality liquid assets so that they can safely meet their potential liquidity needs. In other words, like they all do, he's talking about the Treasury market, not Treasury securities and their importance as collateral in a wider sense than just as some form of liquid reserve that is there in case banks need it. That's not what Salomon Brothers or the other 98 broker dealers were interested in. They were interested in controlling the flow of collateral through the financial system, not holding reserve assets in case they could potentially need them. Authorities either don't get it or they don't want you to figure out what the monetary world is really about, and that's not federal funds rates and targets. That right there is the real scandal, not necessarily Salomon Brothers. All these years later, they still don't understand that collateral controls the world. Yet, the dealers of the early 1990s and every year since then, they do understand it. This, more than anything, explains the 2008 failure, the Fed's failure, even why the Federal Reserve is not actually a central bank. The importance of collateral, which dealers and bankers understand, is, if anything, even more important today in the 2020s, far more than strictly where it comes from, how it circulates and flows. That's what repo really is. It's the flow of money and the flow of collateral. They all got it. We still don't get it. Now, I've done an entire series of what we call classroom videos in Eurodollar University's members section that deals with the history of collateral, the mechanics of this flow, what it all is, and why. It wasn't an inept little scam after all. The Salomon Brothers scandal was emblematic of a world that had radically changed. And what happens when regulators can't keep up with all of it? Not only is the public completely left in the dark, not knowing what we don't know, it paved the way for the inevitable downfall. If I had to sum up the 2008 crisis in a single term, it would be collateral shortage. Jay Powell doesn't get it, nor Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke before him. But Salomon Brothers and all the other cheaters, they had figured out long before the early 90s the value of collateral flow. Why is collateral flow so important to the modern system? How did it get to be this way? I put one of our members' videos on that in the Make It Make Sense playlist. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.